Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. I begin in the name of Allah, the most gracious and most merciful. Praise be to Him and peace and blessings be upon His noble messenger. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome. So, inshallah, as mentioned, we're going to explore different angles of zakah. Usually, to try and introduce zakah, I think the framework that I like to try and use is what, why, who, how, when, where. So if we use that as our framework, we should be able to cover all of the angles. So I will cover within that sort of the spiritual aspects of zakah, practical aspects of zakah, etc. And hopefully give you a comprehensive idea of what this is all about. And inshallah, whether you are a sort of fully fledged, practicing, aware, conscious Muslim, or you're completely new to the faith, or hopefully wherever you are in that spectrum, you'll hopefully pick up something and learn something about this particular topic. A couple of corrections to the introduction. So one is that I did 2 years of economics in Cambridge, and then I shifted for the last year to the management tripos because I hated economics. So my first was actually in my final year in management. So let's get that right. And then I spent 5 years in investment banking as well before doing this, to save myself first and foremost, and then to try and save other people along with me. But just to fill in the gaps. And at the end of my talk, I'll talk a little bit about National Zakat Foundation and the work that we do, but it's not really supposed to be an advert, although this of course is a permanent advert throughout this talk. Okay, so what is zakah? Zakah is the third pillar of Islam. Just to give that the context, I'm sure we're all aware. So the first pillar being the shahada, bearing witness, effectively a statement of belief and believing that with tongue and heart and action. The second being the 5 daily prayers. The third being zakah. The fourth being fasting in Ramadan, and the fifth being the Hajj, the pilgrimage. So zakah stands out from those pillars, I would say, as probably the one that has the strongest horizontal as well as vertical dimension. So all the other pillars arguably have they all have a communal aspect, there's no doubt about that. But they have a communal aspect in the sense of doing those other acts of worship together with other people. Whereas zakah involves an exchange, a direct exchange from payers to recipients. So you have the payers of zakah, you have the recipients of zakah. And so it is kind of different from the other pillars in that regard. So one can become Muslim, then we pray together, but we're all praying, and it isn't necessarily the case that the extent or the quality of my prayer affects the quality or the extent of your prayer, etc., etc. We may do it together, we may do it separately. Similar with fasting Ramadan, there may or may not be, in practical terms, a communal aspect to that. Of course, we see that mosques are full, and during Ramadan there is a strong community aspect to it, in no doubt. But again, the quality of one's fast doesn't necessarily affect or take away from the quality of somebody else's fast. Similar with the Hajj, obviously it's a massive gathering, it's a huge communal thing. But in theory, any of these things could be done alone, or in a sort of solitary fashion, if you like. Whereas with zakah, it is by necessity involves other people from the perspective that there are payers and recipients. So that's an important maybe differentiation between zakah and some of the other pillars in Islam. So it's an obligatory annual payment or duty, alms giving, and obviously, especially in today's context, we need to clarify the spelling of alms, ALMS. So an alms sort of giving, and it's done in the context. When you say annual, we're talking about once every lunar year. So in the Islamic lunar year, so once every lunar, which is approximately 355 days, so around 10-11 days shorter than the Gregorian calendar, the solar year. I think one thing to be said is that although our association with zakah is typically as charity and obligatory, or which was sometimes translated to mean obligatory charity, I think it's fair to say probably that, or fair to contend, I would put forward that actually it's really not charity in a sense. It's more almost like a kind of I would say more of a sort of financial system of sorts, okay, which involves, of course, what might look like a charitable payment, but really it is ultimately, if we believe it to be an obligation, it's an obligatory payment. It's calculated, it has a certain formula for how we get to that calculation, and certain thresholds that define who pays and who doesn't pay and all the rest of it. So if you like, there is very little in common between zakah, I think, as it is to be practiced, and our sort of general understanding of charity. The charity in general we kind of understand to be something where the giver is completely in control. So even in an Islamic context, voluntary charity, and therefore in the general kind of secular context, the concept of charity has extremely broad kind of connotations, possibilities, motivations, etc., etc. One can give for all sorts of reasons, to all sorts of causes, etc. Whereas zakah is very specific in terms of who pays, where it is paid, how it is used, etc., etc. So it's more, I think, to be thought of as a kind of some sort of social system, as opposed to necessarily charity in the broader sense. And I think it's quite important as Muslims, adhering to this particular pillar, and just from the outside, just to understand this pillar, that it is different, and therefore the intentions and the motivations and the understanding of what we're achieving when we give zakah, are different to maybe sort of general understandings of what it means to give charity. So that's the what of zakah. Hopefully I've kind of covered just overall the sort of general idea of what zakah is all about. So why zakah? What is the purpose of it? Linguistically, the word zakah comes from an Arabic root word that gives meanings of purification primarily, but also growth and development and blessing as well. So the idea of the payment of zakah, first and foremost, is as a way of drawing oneself closer to one's Lord, just as all the other pillars, obviously have that as a prime motivation, fulfilling an obligation, a duty, and doing so with the motivation of purifying oneself. So there is an element of purifying oneself from greed and miserliness, and almost to encourage or give some base foundation to encourage further acts of giving, voluntary acts of giving. So just as with all the other pillars, there are the obligatory elements, then there are the supplementary elements. So as with prayer and obviously fasting and even the pilgrimage, because there is the obligatory pilgrimage, and then there's, if you like, the minor pilgrimage, the umrah, as you know. So as with zakah, there's the obligatory zakah, and then there's the sadaqah, or the voluntary giving, right? So the why of zakah is as I mentioned, fulfilling that obligation, purifying oneself from greed, from miserliness, purifying one's wealth. There is the idea of purifying one's wealth. So even if one's wealth is lawfully earned, to have the idea of perhaps involved within that was some degree of dishonesty or even unintentional. There wasn't, even if, for example, you were employed in a perfectly, from an Islamic perspective, lawful job. Maybe you didn't always turn up exactly at 9 a.m. and exactly leave when you were supposed to. Maybe you undercut. Maybe you fell short of what you did. And so there's the idea of almost purifying your wealth as well. And actually, quite strong sort of prophetic traditions about the harm, therefore, of leaving unpaid zakah within one's wealth. It's as if you're leaving impurities within your own wealth, and therefore detracting or taking away the blessings of whatever you might do then with your wealth. There is also the concept of, when it comes to zakah, which we'll touch on a bit later on, of it being a divinely ordained right of the recipient. So this comes back to this idea, there's not so much charity, because with charity comes the idea in general, comes the idea of that one's doing a favour to the end beneficiary, whereas with zakah that concept isn't there at all. In fact, one's doing more one's favour to oneself by meeting this obligation. And then there is that concept, therefore, withholding zakah being almost like stealing from a poor person. So to try and give a sort of a tangible example, if you imagine a homeless person who's just sitting and collecting coins somewhere in the street in Oxford, and people go along, and some people give and some people just walk by, or whatever it might be, but then just imagine somebody going by and just taking the cup and then moving on. Almost the idea of not paying zakah would almost be that's something which is kind of the right of this person. We've actually we've taken, we've almost stolen, if you like. So it's quite a serious matter in that sense. It's almost as if God has not left it to chance that people who fall below a certain threshold should be taken care of, or should be at least be ensured that they're living to some sort of minimum standard. So poverty, or certain degree of poverty, is something which in this system should not be allowed to be a reality at all. And it's quite it can be easily argued that were all zakah globally to be paid and administered and distributed properly, so if all Muslims at least were to just, those who should be paying zakat, paid zakat properly and it was properly administered, that poverty would be, probably quite an unlikely scenario in many places, if not completely eradicated. So I think a recent estimate that I heard from the Islamic Development Bank in Saudi Arabia was that the global zakat capacity is approximately $600 billion. That's one estimate. From a UK standpoint, like our own sort of ballpark estimate, although kind of further on more detailed analysis needs to be done in this area, is that just the capacity of the UK Muslim community alone, which relatively in the UK context is a relatively impoverished community actually compared to the rest of the community in this country, we'll talk about that as well later perhaps, that the capacity of the community in this country is probably at least £500 million a year. So it's very significant in terms of what that can achieve, right? In terms of lifting people out of complete desperation. So we were talking about the why and the motivation. So the why in terms of, and this must be foremost in terms of the payer's motivation as doing this because I need to do this. Just as the motivation, I'm sure has been mentioned before and will be mentioned in discussions about the other pillars, is that there is definitely a selfish motivation, if you like, of I need this, I'm doing this to purify myself, to draw close to my Lord, etc., etc., to earn His pleasure, to avert His wrath, etc., etc. So there's all of those motivations, and then there are kind of just the real world effects of the giving of zakah and the proper distribution of zakah that obviously mean that, as we talked about, that people wouldn't be left, below a certain standard of, below a certain level of standard of living, if you like. We'll talk about the other elements in terms of who receives zakah and the wider wisdoms of zakah as well a bit later on. But it's also important to understand that zakah, it's again fair to argue, well, this is an issue of debate, that zakah is not just about alleviating poverty, but it's about much more than that as well. That is a priority in terms of zakah distribution, but it's not the only thing that zakah is concerned with, and we can talk about that later. From a top-down perspective, in terms of the spiritual aspects and the why of zakah, there is a strong association in the Quran as well as in various prophetic traditions about the link, direct link, both individually but also at a communal level, between the extent of adherence to zakah and, if you like, divine mercy upon an individual, upon a community. So in the Quran, for example, the word zakah is mentioned 32 times. The word zakah itself is mentioned 32 times. Twice it is mentioned purely with its linguistic meaning, if you like. So we talk about purification, others, so not in reference to the pillar of Islam. And 30 times in reference to the pillar of Islam, right? And the giving aspect. And there are also, that's just the word zakah. Outside of this, there are also references to zakah using the word sadaqah. Sadaqah, we understand today, or when we talk about sadaqah, we understand that to mean voluntary charity. But in the Quran, as well as in various prophetic traditions, the word sadaqah and zakah are sometimes interchangeably used to mean zakah. So part of the kind of scholarly, effort there is to kind of distinguish, well, when does it mean obligatory and when does it mean, voluntary? But there are many sort of examples in the Quran or verses where the word sadaqah is used, but it clearly refers to the obligatory giving. Again, we can talk about that later. But the reason what I was going to mention there is that so of the 30 times that the word zakah is mentioned, 28 times it is conjoined with the prayer, salah. So that's quite significant. So in terms of like the 5 pillars of Islam, salah and zakah, prayer and let's call it almsgiving, are the oft repeated pillars of Islam, if you like, within the Quran. And very interestingly, in the context of previous prophets as well. So you'll have references for Jesus and and other prophets historically where they will be talking about salah and zakah, prayer and almsgiving, which of course had a different, as far as we believe, had a completely different form in terms of previous prophetic traditions, but at the core those concepts were there. And so, if you like, the prayer and almsgiving, if you like, are the age-old foundational kind of structures, if you like, for faith or for demonstrating one's faith and belief in God. So, two of these 30 occasions, as zakah is mentioned in just outside of the context of prayer, so in the general context. And one of the verses, which is then bringing me back to my original point with regards to that kind of top-down or communal significance of zakah, is in chapter number 7, in a Quranic verse which talks about the mercy of God. So the verse says, قَالَ عَذَابِي أُصِيبُ بِهِ مَنْ أَشَاءُ وَرَحْمَتِي وَسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. So God says that with my punishment I may afflict whoever I wish. However, my mercy envelops everything, or encompasses everything. Mercy is my dominant quality. فَسَأَكْتُبُهَا لِلَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ بِآيَاتِنَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. And I will prescribe that mercy specifically for those who have display God consciousness, for those who give zakah, and for those who believe in our signs and our verses. And then there are other descriptions of those who warrant God's mercy. But this is quite an interesting verse in the sense that the act of zakah here, okay, is quite almost seemingly randomly placed, or unusually placed, I should say. Unusually placed in the sense that it isn't out of, again, not mentioned with the prayer, so that's number one, we've already identified that. But also because when you're talking about something very overarching, the concept of God's mercy coming to an individual or a community, and then the first and third thing that are mentioned are these overarching concepts of God consciousness and belief in his verses and his signs, etc. And then in the middle you have this act of giving zakah. That's a kind of unusual kind of placement. Anything could have been put there, really. There was many other acts of worship potentially that could have been put there. But there is that kind of sense of mercy, the amount of mercy descending on an individual, on a community, somehow being correlated to, if you want to put a graph up against that, or the adherence to zakah. So from a kind of communal standpoint, from a community standpoint, we talk about the issues we're facing, in this country, globally. It's not new news, or it's not a surprise that the Muslim community all over the place is facing, many difficulties. From a spiritual standpoint, one could make a case that actually part of that maybe as a result of the fact that we're just not adhering to our zakah properly, for example. Were we to do so, that might incur more of the divine mercy, which then would help us deal with our wider issues and problems. So that's something to bear in mind. I'll give a couple of examples, a couple of examples of other verses in the Quran where zakah is mentioned. So famous beginning of chapter, I think chapter number 23, Al-Mu'minun, the believers. God says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, successful indeed are the believers, الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتٍ خَاشِعُونَ, those who are humble in their prayer, so referencing the prayer, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ, those who turn away from idle and false and pointless talk, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ, those who give zakah or adhere to zakah. So that's mentioned here. In another verse, God talks about people, رجال لا تلهيهم تجارة ولا بيع عن ذكر الله وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة. He talks about people whom trade and engaging in business don't divert them from remembering God and establishing prayer and giving zakah, giving this paying zakah. And he talks about, so that's quite an interesting verse, because it's one of the verses that is used to kind of I suppose to teach us as Muslims that we should very much be in this world but not of this world, in the sense that God didn't say don't engage in this world, don't be part of this world, kind of become, separate yourself completely from the realities of this world in terms of what you need to do to get along. However, he did say that the believers, or the ones that he favors the most, are those who are involved in the day-to-day, and they get involved in trade and business and whatever they need to do to get along, but none of that makes them forget the ultimate reality, and none of that makes them forget him and establishing the prayer and giving zakah and all of those things. Again, the phraseology or the way it's written is quite, I suppose, significant. So these are hopefully just gives you an indication of some of the spiritual aspects of zakah. It's central, very, very central, literally central within the 5 pillars, the third of 5, and just this very central place in the kind of Islamic ecosystem, if you like, of worship. And I suppose the cornerstone of social in communal kind of well-being and harmony as well. Because to be perfectly honest, as we witness in our world today, and someone can understand this simply from a theoretical perspective, inequality of wealth, or the fact that Islam is not a communist sort of system, nor is it a kind of outright, unbridled capitalist system either, but it's potentially arguably something in the middle, and maybe people can theorize about what you feel about that later on. But this is surely zakah is surely the cornerstone of redressing some sort of balance within, in that kind of, in that whole discussion around wealth inequality and all of the rest of it. It's nothing to say that, yes, people can't get super rich. At the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, some of the companions were, in today's terms, billionaires, right? If we were to look at it in that context. And others were in great difficulty at many times. But zakah was effectively there to at least give some, as we talked about, minimum threshold, minimum standard of living to those who are at the bottom end of the economic spectrum. Okay, so that's the what and the why. So the who. So we'll look at who pays and who receives. So who pays? This is an interesting kind of a point of discussion. So at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and looking at the prophetic traditions around who pays zakah, the reference is kind of made to especially gold and silver, because at that time gold and silver effectively were the means of exchange. And until today, effectively, cash equivalents of whatever those measures of gold and silver were, are then used to say, well, if you come above such and such a level, that you should pay zakah. The only issue is, of course, is that although at that time the gold and silver amounts, when they were given, were perhaps equal or similar in value at that time, so if you have this amount of gold or this amount of silver, and they were similar in value, then you pay zakah. Because of what, the whole sort of commodity sort of infrastructure and that whole where that whole system has gone, there's a massive delinking between real and real value and what people are paying in markets and all of that stuff. And obviously gold and silver are basically delinked in effect. I mean, there's not really there's that linkage or that equivalence anymore. So in today's terms, for example, the nisab, or the threshold above which one pays zakah and below which one potentially receives zakah, in silver terms equates to, in pound terms, about £200 in silver terms. In gold terms equates to around £2,000. So it's quite a wide divergence. But still relatively low. I mean, I'm not sure what you had in mind potentially about what those figures might look like. But certainly what we're saying here, that if at a point in time when one's zakah becomes due, one has above £200 net, your net, I mean technically speaking, your net zakatable worth, let's say, is above £200, then one should pay 2.5% as zakah. So if you have £300, it will be £7.50. And working at the National Zakat Foundation, dividing everything by 40 is something, a skill you develop quite fast. So 2.5% is the rate, okay, of zakah payment. It's not the only rate of zakah payment. Is anyone aware of what the other rates of zakah payment are? Or did we think that was the only rate? Anyone? No?
Then another 20%, which they say, like, for the profit, upon profit, or the treasure and all that.
Oh, right, okay, fine. So fine. So for exactly, so you have 5, 10, and 20% as well. Although these are on asset types or asset classes, which in our context, or when I say in our context, I don't mean necessarily globally, but certainly for us living here, maybe aren't as relevant, although it does apply to some people. So there are different rules, for example, for cattle and sheep and all the rest of it, and how many, so livestock and what proportions. So when you get to a certain number of sheep, you give this much, and when you get to another number of sheep, you give this much. There are also in the context of crops, so 5% on harvest, at the point of harvest of various crops, or 10%, and it will be 5% or 10% dependent upon whether there was, let's say, the farmer's involvement in the irrigation, the cultivation of those crops, or whether it was more naturally done. So 10% is if basically there wasn't much farmer's involvement, let's say, but 5% if there was. And 20% is upon certain natural minerals or was underground kind of wealth, if you like. A lot of these things, by the way, I'm just giving a high level, but there's a lot of discussion about these things, because there's a whole discussion about, for example, oil and zakat on oil, right? Which you can imagine opens a huge sort of debates. Anyway, and one for later perhaps. But there is the wisdom around that is that actually the least rate of zakah, or the lowest rate of zakah I should say, is upon the types of wealth that man has worked hardest for, right? So the cash from one hand, one's business assets, etc. These things are at 2.5%. The stuff that's underground and we did basically nothing for, and sort of millions of years worth of whatever the processes were, I've forgotten, GCSE, whatever, geography, whatever it was, right? That came together to do all of that. Okay, well that's 20%, right? And it said, and that's shown most clearly in that irrigation issue around the crops, so where there was kind of labour-intensive farming in effect, then there was a lower percentage applied and a higher percentage applied for where that wasn't the case. Okay, so in terms of that's just on a side note, in terms of the 2.5%, which is basically what applies generally to all of us, or would apply potentially, is that we would pay, as I said, if one's net zakatable worth at a particular, on one's zakat anniversary or zakat due date, if you like, comes above this threshold, then we would pay zakat 2.5%. If it's below that threshold, okay, then potentially we could receive zakat. We potentially could receive zakat, depending on the circumstances. I'll try and leave it as simple as that for now. I think later on, maybe if it gets more technical and people ask lots of questions about that and how it's calculated and all the rest of it, but I'll leave it there for now. In terms of who receives zakah, so there are 8 categories defined in the Quran. So this is chapter 9, verses 60 in the Quran, where 8 categories are specifically mentioned. These categories are as follows. So the verse says, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ. So this is actually one of the verses where the word sadaqah is used, but it references zakah, and it's kind of, consensually understood that it refers to zakah. لِلْفُقَرَاء, for the poor, وَالْمَسَاكِينَ, the destitute. So the poor and the destitute. Then there's a whole discussion about what's the difference between these two precisely. Broadly speaking, one is kind of those in absolute poverty, let's say, and perhaps the other is those in relative kind of poverty. Both are mentioned, perhaps maybe just to give an idea of priority. For Quran Masakin, it's also significant that these are the first 2 of the 8, right? وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا. So this is a very interesting category. This refers to the administrators of zakah. Okay, so we have it in the community. There is a lot of discussion, and in general, a lot of discussion around administrative costs of of charities and how charities spend money and all the rest of it. But based on this verse, even God allows for admin, right? Because the third category is quite significant, I would say. That the third category says, well, actually some zakah can be used to ensure that the whole system actually operates. It's a self-funded system to make sure that the collection and the distribution, everything happens properly. Because it is a huge process. If you just think about the reality, if you think about the reality of even just the community in this country, the reality of accurately supporting and advising around the collection of hundreds of millions of pounds of zakah, and then accurately and properly administering hundreds of millions of pounds of zakah, that's no small task. So within that, there is this allowance, if you like. The third category is the amilin, or the administrators. The fourth category, وَالْمُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبُهُمْ. Okay, so this category, the literal translation is those whose hearts are to be reconciled. Okay, so this is an interesting category and a hotly debated one, to be honest, about exactly what it means. Historically, there's an understanding that sometimes historically this meant, for example, new Muslims. So Muslims who have just entered into the faith, to whom, if generosity was shown, it would kind of bind them within the community more and make them feel welcome, etc., etc. So some support could be given in that way. Others saw it as well, if you're talking about those whose hearts are to be reconciled, well, maybe it's about using money in a more tactical way in relation to those people whose hearts are anything but reconciled, and therefore by using money to this way or that way in dealing with such people, that it might even ward off them doing something harmful for, say, the community at large, for example. For others, it was there's that kind of softening type element, to maybe hostile, people, individuals, tribes at that time, whatever it might be. So there was almost like so you can see there that there's an indication potentially of more of a strategic kind of use of zakah funds to have that kind of impact or benefit. But then again, whether that was definitely the case, definitely not the case, whether it has current applicability or not, is a debated issue. Then you have وَفِي الرِّقَابِ الْغَارِمِينَ. So وَفِي الرِّقَاب means kind of for the emancipation of slaves, especially at the time, and even in a modern day context. If you're talking about where funds are necessary to deal with modern day slavery, trafficking, prostitution, these kinds of things, where zakah funds can be used, if money is a way to actually pave the way to kind of solving some of those problems, that zakah could be used potentially for some of those things. وَالْغَارِمِينَ, those who are in debt, so to relieve the debt of those who are in debt, again with certain conditions and all the rest of it. وَفِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ. وَفِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ means, literally translates as in the way of God. So classically this was kind of interpreted or understood to be for the defense of the community. So where a community is literally under attack, that zakat could be because you're equating an amount or a weight of silver, right, in terms of the current kind of pound value. So let's just call it £200 for argument's sake. So the first time you come above this threshold in terms of your situation, your wealth, your net zakatable wealth, let's call it, then as soon as that happens, your clock starts ticking, and then 1 year later on, 1 lunar year later on technically, okay, your first zakat becomes due. On that day, you will then sit down and you will work out, well, today, what is my net zakatable worth today? If you're above that threshold of £200, for example, then you would then pay 2.5% of your total net zakatable worth. So it isn't an income-based thing. So you could, be working in investment banking, for example, and earn £100,000 a year, or whatever, but you may spend £100,000 a year, right? By the end of it, if you may have a high income but pay relatively little zakat potentially, right? Depending on what you do and how you do it. Now, some may look at that and think, well, that sounds a bit unfair, and so what's going on there, etc., etc. I mean, I think generally there is a kind of correlation between those who, earn high amounts and then invest their money and businesses and all the rest of it, and the amount of zakat that is paid. But it is a wealth-related, form of giving, and does not necessarily relate directly to income. Issues of income are kind of dealt with within perhaps the general encouragement to kind of spontaneous or voluntary charity, one, and also dealt with in the context of that obviously holistically Islam encourages a modest living, or or certainly discourages extravagance, right? So if there is extravagance, and obviously that has different meanings in different contexts and times and places, if there is extravagance, and sometimes if there are, in some places, one hears of deliberate practices to almost minimize one's zakah, for example. So, let's go and spend such and such, or make sure that I buy such and such before my zakah anniversary, so I don't have to pay zakah. Well, these are matters of intention and matters of faith and matters of one's, relationship with God and all the rest of it. So that's I suppose separate. That's a separate discussion to necessarily the kind of the at least the principles or the objective financial calculations. So yeah, as I mentioned, you would do that, and then every year on that date, so you would have a zakat anniversary on this particular date, and then you would on that date assess your situation, and going through your various assets. So the things that you would kind of take into account are the cash that you have, gold and silver, business assets potentially kind of equity, investments, shares, and what have you, money that is owed to you. So if you have lent somebody money, they owe you money, it's a good debt, you expect to recover that, you would include that within your zakat calculation, because it is like a receivable, if you like, or an asset. So you look at all of these things. If you own a farm, cattle and sheep, and if you own crops and all of that stuff, right? So you kind of add all of this together on one side, and then on the other side you would look at, okay, do I have any bills or payments outstanding? Okay, do I have certain debts? And debts have their own, there's a whole detail around debts and how debts are to be dealt with and all the rest of it. But effectively, debts that are due or overdue are deductible, right, from your calculation. And there is some given allowance for those debts that are due to be repaid, or the portion of debt that is due to be repaid between now and your next zakat anniversary, also to be deductible. Since we're in a university context, I just mentioned on the issue of student loans, because that's always the one that comes up. So whilst a student is at university, student loans are not deductible for zakat purposes. And the reason for that is because nothing is due. Right? When you're at university and if you've taken on a student loan, this year, next year in your studies, nothing is due. You have to fulfill certain conditions before that debt becomes a real debt, if you like. So then once has started to work and is earning a certain salary, and then this debt becomes due, and then potentially certain elements of it can be factored in, and that's a separate thing. But there is a common misconception amongst students, because students just generally like to feel poor and kind of oppressed and no money and everything's bad and all the rest of it, that, I don't have to pay zakat. And there's another big association, or we have an understanding in our community that one only pays zakat when one starts working. But actually nothing I've talked about so far supports that whatsoever, because it's a matter of how much money do I have, regardless of where it came from. So if you just happen to come from a wealthy family and your parents have given you a lot of money over the course of your teenage years, and this is in your name and now it's effectively yours, or they've invested in a junior ISA over the course of many years, and now you become 18 and now this becomes your wealth, for example, right? This is your wealth, and you should pay zakat on your wealth, regardless of it. So whether you inherited it, or it was given to you, it was gifted to you, you worked really hard for it, whatever it was, right? You have that wealth on that time, and it's unencumbered and it's yours, and you possess it. Then it should be included in your zakat calculation. And in terms of the how of the distribution of zakat, then there is a strong strong emphasis on the issue of ownership, okay, of the wealth, or at least the ability for the recipient to determine the usage of those funds. So this is again quite different from, for example, general charity, where, for example, a charity may set up a program to do things the way it wants to do it. We give the charity, say, voluntary funds, for example, and then they go and do what they, obviously with the best intention, whatever, they try to serve the end recipient however they want to. But the point about zakat distribution is that a lot of respect is given to the wishes of the recipient, because as we said earlier on, it is their right to receive these funds. And actually, and even currently, I don't know if which of you follow these kind of things or not, but even in an international development context, the talk in the last kind of few years, especially and kind of currently, is there's a lot of talk about the wisdom of just giving cash to poor people in poor countries, as opposed to doing this program and that program, and almost things that I assume that they don't know what they're doing, basically. So we need to construct the infrastructure ourselves and plonk it there, and then that will benefit them. But there is a lot of talk around the effectiveness of literally just entrusting, kind of people with cash, and they will make best use. And there's kind of various reports and evidences around all of that stuff. But at the core, that's what zakat is, in terms of it. It is almost like you need zakat, I have zakat to pay. Here you go, right? That's on kind of one-on-one basis. When you're looking at it from a more systematized sort of setup, or an institutional kind of setup, then there are many ways, of course, in which one can, I suppose, achieve both, or achieve a middle ground between respecting the needs and the specific circumstances of an individual, whilst at the same time making arguably best use or achieving highest impact with the zakat in its distribution. So just in terms of the work that we do at National Zakat Foundation, that's the kind of thing, the challenge we go through, because we don't, for example, for those people that we support, just give cash handouts. Right? There is a kind of almost a conversation that takes place for this person to identify what they feel their needs are, and for us to support them to identify and to kind of achieve some sort of agreement or common ground about why don't we do this, because it will achieve X, Y, Z. They agree to that, and then we go and do it. Anyway, I can talk about that later. So last couple of points. One is the issue of when. So when is it paid? So it's paid, we've talked about when it's paid annually, once every year. Once one's zakat anniversary comes and one makes a calculation and say, okay, fine, I have to pay £500 of zakat, yeah, I should pay that immediately. Okay, if there's no reason to delay it, then I should just pay it then and there. And so the idea is, because of course when one's wealth comes above that threshold for the first time, obviously zakat's not paid then. Zakat's paid for the first time 1 year on. So zakat is almost to be seen as a payment that's made at the end of just to clean up one's zakat year, if you like. Right, so you do what you do, you live your life. You don't necessarily have to think about the zakat necessarily. You just go and do what you have to do. You come to now we've come to that point. You assess where you stand. You pay zakat, and then your new cycle begins. Okay, and then you carry on. You do what you do. You buy, you sell, etc., etc. The date comes again. You assess your situation. If you have to pay, you pay. So that is in terms of when it is paid, and then in terms of its distribution, then it is if one gives one zakat to an individual, if one gives one zakat to an organisation, or even if one gives zakat to, for example, eligible family members, for example, then it is recommended, or even obligated, I would say, for that distribution to have taken place at the latest before your next zakat becomes due. So the idea of zakat distribution is that it should be annually distributed. Charities or individuals or whoever shouldn't be sitting on zakat this year from 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago. That should have been, it should be flowing through, right? And it should be kind of, it should be passing through to the end recipients. Just in terms of one thing I didn't mention, of course, is that one of the wisdoms of zakat is to discourage the hoarding of wealth. And one thing that's quite common in our community, especially in the kind of subcontinental Asian communities, is just sitting on piles of gold. Basically, I mean, gold is a kind of given at weddings and and we just oftentimes, we come across the situations where a family or a lady who otherwise might be actually in quite dire circumstances, but is sitting on 20,000 or 30,000 pounds of gold that was given many years ago at a wedding, but it's kind of this, there's a certain cultural association with it. It means this thing's just untouchable, and we literally have to die before we can do anything with this gold, right? So part of the wisdom of zakat is to discourage such practice, because even in kind of a practical, part of it is to encourage investment and to encourage economic activity as well, and the flow and movement of wealth and funds, not to just sit on wealth. So what the second caliph, Umar, was famous for once advising the guardians of orphans to make sure to not to just let their wealth sit there, and for zakat just to be paid on that wealth year on year, such that when the orphan would mature to a certain age, that that basically the wealth would be diminished. He would encourage the guardians of the orphans to basically go and invest the wealth, do something with it, try and grow the pile, right, for the orphan, because that would be good guardianship. That actually brings up another interesting point, which is a difference of opinion historically amongst Muslim scholars about whether zakat is a due on the individual, or whether it's a due on the wealth. Because if it's a due on the individual, an individual obligation, then according to one school of thought, zakat doesn't become due on your wealth until you reach the age of maturity, at which point other acts of worship also become obligatory. Right? So up to a certain age, 13, 14, 15, whatever it may be, prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, if one has economic needs, etc., are not obligatory. Beyond that age, they become obligatory. So if it's a due on the individual, then it's only at that point that one becomes liable to pay zakat. The view of the majority of scholars was that zakat is due on the wealth. So even if one has a child, okay, for example, even a baby who has wealth held in their name, or for example, a daughter who has gold bangles or bracelets or something, right? Because that's again what happens in our community. By the time I have two girls, and they're 1 and 2 years old, but I'm sure they're collectively more wealthy than I am, just by looking at their the gold that's kind of showered upon them from family members and what have you. So I pay, when I calculate my zakat, I do a separate calculation for their wealth, or money that we've put aside for them, for example, an investment that we may have made for them, as a separate thing. Because the view of the majority is that zakat is due on the wealth, and it should still be calculated and paid on the if you like, the worth, or the financial worth of that even child, baby, etc., etc. So, as I said, a matter of dispute, but just to present that to you. Lastly, in this kind of what, why, when, who, etc., the where of it. So, it's always a classical principle of zakat for zakat to be locally distributed. So there's a famous tradition where the Prophet, peace be upon him, sent a companion, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, to Yemen, and with the kind of effectively as a missionary to the people of Yemen, to call them to Islam. And his advice to him was what was significant here. So he advised him to invite the people to Islam and to accept this message, etc., etc. And then he said, if they do that, then encourage them, or to perform the 5 daily prayers. And once they have done that, then inform them that there is a certain a charity, or these alms, to be taken from their rich and redistributed to their poor. And what was significant about that statement is that the Prophet, peace be upon him, didn't say to Mu'adh that collect the zakah from Yemen and bring it back here, and then we'll see what to do about it later. What was significant about the statement is that he specifically mentioned in the wording of that hadith, or that tradition, that the zakah of Yemen should be redistributed within Yemen. And in the books of kind of Islamic legal sort of thought and principles, and on the various sort of scholars that have written over the centuries about this, that this issue is always mentioned about a priority to be given to one's local community. But then there is also mention of, for example, eligible family members. So one's immediate family, so especially ascendants and descendants, are not eligible for zakat, or those for whom one has a economic duty already. So in Islam, so a man has financial responsibility towards his wife. He is primarily responsible, to ensure that her sort of her basic needs, etc., etc., are catered for, financially speaking, and he cannot use zakat to then contribute to that process, if you like, because that's already part of his duty. So he can't then say, well, I've got zakat to pay, so that will help me, sort of take care of some of that burden, for want of a better phrase. And so similarly with one's children, one is already financially responsible, one is also financially responsible for one's parents if they are in need, and then one is ordinarily responsible. So these things are part of just day-to-day responsibility. But there is then a discussion. A woman could give zakat to her husband, for example, because she is not ordinarily responsible for him. If he is struggling and she happens to be, wealthy, or she happens to have this pile of gold or whatever, and he's in a particular circumstance, there's some have the opinion that that can be done. But then eligible family members, like wider family members, possibly siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, in-laws, etc., like those, one is recommended to then, or one is encouraged rather to consider those eligible family members who may be in difficulty, may be in need. Of course, so there's a reward given, therefore, not only just for the act of giving, but also for the act of, if you like, binding the ties of kinship, etc. There is obviously a huge positive to that, and we can understand that. There's also kind of some caution to be applied, because sometimes that giving starts to become customary and blind, and almost just habitual for the sake of it being so, without real understanding what the actual circumstances are, but just to kind of this general sort of giving. So there is some caution to be applied, because the eligibility to receive needs to be established and understood as well. And whilst that isn't something that necessarily needs to be directly measured, right? But one should be at least, let's say, more than 50% sure that yes, so and so is eligible to receive zakat and not liable to pay, because it's sometimes possible that somebody who apparently is struggling, but then has a situation where they're sitting on gold and other kinds of assets which would be considered to be subject to zakat, actually should be paying zakat. So well, why are we giving zakat to this person as well? So there is that needs to be just borne in mind. Then, of course, consideration is given to where the situation is most dire, where there is most need. Okay. So in our context, what's interesting is that we have all three of these factors at play. I mean, the way the community has kind of come together here, there is a situation in our local community in the UK where there are many eligible recipients of zakah, although it's not something which I suppose up until recently many people have been kind of fully conscious of, I think, or certainly haven't prioritised. The eligible family kind of member stuff, I think, is kind of going or has been going on, but just simply as a matter of course, or a matter of time, is it probably a decreasing or dying trend at some stage, just because of as the community becomes more established here, and there are less family links elsewhere, etc. But of course, there's no shortage of crises around the world where one can give one's zakah. So I think that in line with everything else that we've said about zakah so far, is that it's not necessarily maybe an emotional decision as much as it should be a decision of how am I fulfilling my duty now, because there is a certain duty I have to those in my local community or in my country, at least, a certain duty I have to those who are suffering extreme levels of difficulty and poverty internationally, for example, and a certain duty I have to those who are my eligible family members. And so perhaps some sort of almost kind of portfolio approach to one's giving should be adopted to ensure that, okay, I feel I'm fulfilling my duty to these various categories of people. Because but of course, if the issue of local giving or local zakat distribution was to be fully adopted everywhere, then of course everything would take care of itself, because there's no shortage of wealth or zakat to be paid in the Middle East, for example, and obviously there's no shortage of crises in the Middle East at the same time. If zakat was to be used effectively there to actually, I think the BBC article, I think something this time last year, cited there was kind of $5 trillion of private wealth in the Middle East. Well, if zakat was to be paid on that wealth, then you're talking about a lot of money, and if it was properly distributed. But in general, globally speaking, and even in our own community, you could argue that there is something of a zakat crisis, in the sense that on average there's a very little understanding really about this topic, I would say. Very little care perhaps given to this calculation. Huge gaps in many places between what should be being paid and what is actually being paid. There is one kind of piece of research I read last year, just looking at, so the thing that I was saying maybe needs to be done for our own UK context was done in Indonesian context. So there was a kind of quite a long report analysis done on what the zakat capacity of Indonesia could be, should be, versus what is actually seemingly being paid in Indonesia, both in terms of what the government collects, but also in terms of what local bodies and charities collect. Because in Indonesia, they have a setup whereby, yes, the government collects zakat, but also they allow for charities and to collect zakat as well. And the conclusion was that it was only a single-digit percentage of what should be being collected and paid actually being paid. So there is that kind of there is that crisis, and I think it's from a Muslim standpoint or Islamic standpoint, it's a crisis just not only in practical terms, just of what we're allowing to happen which we shouldn't really be allowing to happen, just in terms of people, as we talked about before, suffering and coming under a certain threshold of standard of living, etc., etc. But very much so from just a spiritual standpoint of just not adhering to the proper payment and taking this thing as seriously as it should be taken. So yeah, that kind of thing wraps up, hopefully just summarises the whole topic. I'll very quickly talk about the National Zakat Foundation and what the work that we're doing. So when I left banking in 2011, by the end of that year I was then effectively taken as a project manager for this concept, I suppose, that had been launched that year by another charity. So at that time it was a project of another charity, and was brought on to kind of take this thing forward. And really the vision of this of National Zakat Foundation is to be a zakat institution for the UK sort of community, if you like. So as it says here, our objective is to serve zakat payers as well as serve zakat recipients. So both are equivalent beneficiaries of National Zakat Foundation. So other charities, perhaps because they're not set up as zakat organisations, they're set up as organisations to deal with orphans or disasters or wells or whatever it may be. Zakat is one source of income, voluntary donation is a source of income, government grants are a source of income, EU, DFID, etc., etc., right? So these are all multiple sources of income. So they don't have a particular care for zakat's sake. Whereas for us, what we're trying to do is institutionalize zakat in our context. So the idea is to help zakat payers in this country understand and calculate properly. So for that, we've tried to launch a number of different services around that in terms of being able to respond to people's queries and educate and talk about different kind of issues in relation to zakat. We're launching an app, hopefully, a zakat calculation app. So if you've got an iPhone, look out for that. Inshallah, in the next month or 2 months. And if you don't have an iPhone, then we're hoping if that's successful, we're going to launch the Android version as well. And if you have neither, then good on you. So we're doing a number of those kinds of things to help people pay their zakat accurately and properly wherever it's paid. So even if somebody wants to donate to another charity or give to their family, but they get in touch and say, look, I want to give here, but I'm not sure exactly about this particular point of calculation, then we'll facilitate that. And then what we do, which is kind of also makes us unique, is that we are the only body that nationally collects and distributes zakat funds within the UK. So all our distribution is within the UK, and I suppose we focused on that just because that's the gap that there has been, and we've so far sort of distributed close to £3.5 million of zakat locally. We've had close to 3,500 kind of beneficiaries or recipients of zakat. We've also established kind of 4 supported housing projects, 3 for single homeless women, 1 for young ex-offenders who leave prison and are homeless. In this country, actually, there was an event just a few months ago in a report that was written about faith poverty in Britain. The event was in Oxford, actually, in the Oxford Centre of Islamic Studies, hosted by an organisation or run by an organisation called Muslims in Britain Research Network. It's worth checking out. It's a bunch of academics who for the last 10-15 years, mostly kind of seemingly undercover, have been doing all this research about Muslims in Britain and whatnot, I think, in good faith. But more recently have kind of come out and doing more events and a bit more, I suppose more people are becoming aware of them. But they talked about the issue of faith poverty in Britain. So the analysis there was to say, well, let's adjust for issues of ethnicity and issues of, demographics or geography and all of these things. Let's adjust for all those issues and then just look at the issue of faith poverty, if you like. And they found, unfortunately, that Muslims in this country are more than twice as likely as any other faith group to be in poverty. And their definition of poverty, what they were using, was the kind of government definition, which is that an income-based definition of where somebody is 60% or below the median income. And that's the kind of definition of what the poverty line is. We have an issue. We have an issue here, which can be dealt with, because at the same time there's huge wealth in our community as well. So in terms of what can be achieved in terms of the more people paying zakat, adhering to this pillar, so purely just from a personal religious standpoint and the issue of adherence and all the rest of it, but also in terms of what can really be done if we start to reach some of the figures that we're talking about in terms of what that zakat capacity is, in terms of the benefit that can bring and the upliftment that can bring to a community, with large parts of which are really stuck in what is relative poverty and difficulty in our context. There is a huge amount that can be achieved, and we've seen a lot of evidence of that. We've seen that small interventions of zakat can actually literally change the course of someone's life. So we've seen examples where literally a grant of £250 has just, we were going down one sort of side of the road, can literally just go completely the other way around. I mean, I'll give you an example of a case that I often sort of reference as an example of where, I think about 2-3 years ago, a Turkish guy called me, and in doing this work you find that your mobile number just kind of gets everywhere and anywhere, so just random people call me at random times about the fact that they've got this issue or that issue. And now, fortunately, we've built kind of a team and an infrastructure to sort of deal with that. So we have about 17 staff members now, full and part-time. About 8 of them are in our kind of, if you like, zakat distribution team. So these are caseworkers who have backgrounds in, for example, job centres and immigration law, and they've worked in kind of the various infrastructures, if you like, or organisations that allow them then to provide kind of contextual advice and support, right? So anyway, this guy rang me about 3 years ago, and he said, the first thing he said actually was quite interesting. I'll finish on this point. He said, I know you're a zakat organisation because somebody gave me your number, or I found your number, and I know you're a zakat organisation. He said, but I'm in this country, so can I be helped? Because his association was, well, if you're a zakat organisation, you must be sending your money abroad, because that's what we've been doing for the last 30, 40, 50 years in terms of our charity. The only real manifestation of Muslim charity in this country, as far as the community is concerned, is mostly in mosques, in the building of mosques mainly. And so I said, well, you've come through to the right place, because that's exactly what we do. None of our money's going anywhere, so we can definitely try and talk to you. So we sent a couple of volunteers. We found out where he was. We sent a couple of volunteers to go and pick up this guy who was outside Manchester somewhere. And so a Turkish guy, homeless, had just left prison apparently 2-3 weeks prior, and was saying that he wanted to kind of really sort of turn things around, and etc. etc. So we looked at his situation, we looked at the legal side of things, and quite in a thorough sort of situation where you assess what's going on. But literally he didn't have anything, didn't even have a toothbrush, to be honest, right? So they took him, they bought him some essentials, put him up in some temporary accommodation. Okay, so and then we funded that, of course. So that's your first kind of your patch on the wound, if you like. Okay. Then a caseworker who kind of understands the whole context and the system will analyse that further, what's going on, what's the person's situation, their legal status, etc., etc. Assessed all of that. Within 2 to 3 weeks, we had him in his private rented accommodation. He was eligible for benefits, so his housing was taken care of. Okay, so now he's in accommodation. That's been taken care of. So his basic level of sustenance, housing, and if you like, benefits or whatever is taken care of. Now, 2 weeks later, he then calls me, and he's expressing his gratitude and all the rest of it. And he said, look, I've got a problem, which is I found a job. Okay, I found a job, and they want me to start in 2 days. But the job is to kind of wait at a restaurant. Okay, but I don't have the money for the white shirt and the black trousers and the black shoes that they're saying I need to turn up in. And if I don't turn up in these clothes, then I'm fearful that they won't basically allow me to work there. So I was like, well, knock yourself out, £100 next vouchers or whatever it was that we gave him. Probably wasn't next, but we gave him. We sent him some vouchers, whatever. He bought himself what he needed. 2 days later, he started work, and then that's it. If you think about the total money was put in there, it's probably not more than £500 to £600, or probably £600-700 potentially. So we've seen that kind of turnaround. We've actually seen people who were zakat recipients in, say, 2011-12 giving zakat to the National Zakat Foundation in 14-15. So that's quite, one of the first residents of one of our homeless women's projects in 2012 when we launched that. Last year paid £800 of zakat to National Zakat Foundation. So you can kind of see that turnaround is really possible. Now that's not to say that it's all rosy and wonderful and everything, because it's hugely challenging situations, scenarios you find yourself in. Asylum seekers, refugees, that's very topical, of course, and we deal with a lot of that. We work very closely with a number of mainstream charities and organisations who refer individuals to us. So anybody you can really think of, Refugee Council, Red Cross, Refugee Action, Women's Aid, especially the domestic violence charity, all of these charities, we work regularly day to day with all of these charities. And the thing about what we're doing is quite unique, not only in the context of Muslim community charity, it's also unique in a general context, in the sense that most of these large organisations are not actually almost permitted, if you like, or they're not set up in such a way that these kind of small financial grants can just be given. So they might be funded by local authority or by government to do certain things, but certain really obvious things that almost complement that support can't be done. So one last example before I stop talking, because I know when I start I usually don't stop for a long time, is an example of where a charity may have, so one of these refugee charities, for example, might have identified for a certain one of their clients that, okay, so-and-so needs to, we've got the funding to enroll them on such and such a course, right? So they can go 3 days a week for the next 6 weeks, and this course is going to help them with their kind of, with their therapy and their development and their confidence and da-da-da, for example, right? So we've got the funding for the course. Then they'll get in touch and they'll say, look, we want you to budget, right? So these are the kinds, but they say, well, we don't have the money for that, even though it's like very little, in that circumstance, very little funds that's required. So we've sometimes funded that. We've funded, for example, the retraining of refugee doctors. So they were practicing medicine wherever they were. They've come here. There are certain costs associated with them, then kind of, then being able to practice here and doing the exams and whatever else. And we funded those kinds of things. So there's loads of different applications to what we do, to emergency food, accommodation. We funded university students as well, so that's got to be of interest. Right, so those students, Muslim students who, for faith reasons, wouldn't take the interest-based loan, but who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford the fees, all right, completely, and we would contribute potentially to, and we have done, contribute to, I don't know if we've got any students at Oxford, but I know there's a guy in Cambridge this year who's the first of, I don't know, his 11 siblings or whatever from East London or whatever, who's gone to university, and also he's at Cambridge now, sort of studying, who, were it not for whatever, I think it was £3,000 or £4,000 grant that we gave towards the first year of the studies, he wouldn't be there. So, so yeah, that's what we're doing. So if you do find out more about what we're doing, there's some information at the back, and that's it.